60 times. 60 times a parole officer knocked on that door. 60 times Phillip Garrido answered. 60 times the officer wrote the same word in his file. Complied. 60 times he turned around and walked back to his car. Behind the house, past the fence, past the tarps, past the shed with the soundproofed walls, an 11-year-old girl was waiting for someone to come around the back. Nobody did. Not once. Not in 18 years. Her name was Jaycee Lee Dugard. She was taken from a school bus stop in Meyers, California, on the morning of June 10, 1991. She was 5 feet from home. She had a baby sister waiting for her. She had a mother who would spend every year that followed in a state of waiting so total it restructured her entire life around one question she could not stop asking. Behind the fence, 170 miles from that bus stop, a man who had already done this once before was answering parole officers' knocks at the front door. This is the story of what was behind the fence. It is equally the story of what 60 people had every reason to find and didn't. Name sources, confirmed records, court documents and the California Inspector General's official findings. This is Cold Watch response, built for exactly this kind of case. Not the rescue. Not the sentencing. The 18 years in between. Before the bus stop. Before the gray sedan. Before everything that followed. This is who she was. Jaycee Lee Dugard was 11 years old on the morning of June 10, 1991. Born May 3, 1980 in Anaheim, California. Blonde hair. Freckles across her nose. A laugh that neighbors in Meyers, California remembered for years after she was gone. The specific, involuntary way people remember the details of a child who was present in their life and then suddenly wasn't. She had a baby half-sister at home named Shayna. She had a stepfather named Carl Probin, a carpet contractor who had married her mother, Terry, when Jaycee was 7. They were a family still finding its footing in a new town. Terry and Carl had moved from suburban Los Angeles to Meyers in September 1990, 1 year before everything changed, drawn by the kind of life a mountain community offers and the specific feeling that comes with it, the sense that you have put distance between your children and the parts of the world you worry about. Meyers is a Sierra Nevada mountain town of roughly 5,000 people, sitting at 6,200 feet, 5 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe. Ponderosa pines covered the hillsides. Neighbors knew each other's names. You moved there because it was the kind of place where nothing bad happened to children, and you believed it because the evidence supported it. That was not naivety. That was what the town was. Jaycee was finishing 5th grade. The school year had a few days left. Summer was the kind of close you can feel before it officially arrives. On the morning of June 10th, she was dressed and ready. The bus stop was just a few dozen meters from their front door, close enough that Carl could watch her from the yard. He walked her out. She stood at the stop. He turned back toward the house. A gray sedan slowed at the curb. She approached the car the way any child approaches a car that seems to need directions because that is what it looked like. She felt something she later described as tingly, like losing control. A hand. A stun gun against her body. And then she was in the bushes and somebody was dragging her toward the car. Those are Jaycee's own words from her testimony years later. Carl Probin saw it from his yard. He jumped on his mountain bike and rode after the gray sedan as hard as he could. He could not catch it. He stood in the road watching it disappear around a bend. Then he turned and ran inside. "This is 911. My daughter was just kidnapped," Jaycee screamed. Nobody close enough heard her. She was not seen again for 18 years, 2 months and 16 days. The man behind the stun gun was Phillip Garrido, 40 years old, a resident of Antioch, California, 170 miles west of Meyers. Behind the wheel of the gray sedan was his wife, Nancy Garrido. The stun gun was not an impulse. The blanket in the back seat used to cover Jaycee so she couldn't see where she was being taken was not an impulse. Everything about that morning had been planned before he left his driveway. This was not his first time. In 1976, 15 years before that gray sedan appeared at a school bus stop in Meyers, Garrido had kidnapped a woman named Katie Calloway Hall in Nevada. He tied her up, held her captive in a shed, and sexually assaulted her for hours. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 50 years in federal prison plus a life sentence in state court. A sentence built specifically to ensure that Phillip Garrido would never again be free to do what he had already proven capable of. He was released after 11 years. 1988. 3 years before the gray sedan. Katie Calloway Hall did not stay silent after his release. She contacted his parole agent directly. She warned them. She told them Garrido was continuing dangerous behavior and needed closer supervision. She had been in one of his sheds. She had first-hand knowledge, more precise and more reliable than any risk assessment or file review could produce, of exactly what this man was capable of and exactly what he would do the next time he was given access to a victim. The parole agent's response was documented in the official file. Electronic monitoring would be, in the agent's own words, too much of a hassle, based on, and this is a direct quote, the hysteria or concerns of the victim. The hysteria of the victim. 3 years later, a gray sedan, a school bus stop in Meyers, a stun gun in the hand of the same man. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, the state of California, and the FBI's Sacramento Field Office launched one of the largest searches in the county's history. Thousands of volunteers, search dogs, helicopters, tips from across California and Nevada. Carl Probin gave investigators the best description he could: a gray sedan, no plate number, no identifying detail. The search focused on South Lake Tahoe and neighboring Nevada. It never reached the Bay Area. It never reached Contra Costa County. It never reached Antioch, where Garrido had already brought Jaycee home and introduced her to the world he had built. 4 years after she disappeared, Carl Probin carried a second weight alongside his grief. The stepfather who watched his daughter be taken and couldn't catch the car became, in the public imagination and in investigative files, a man who needed to be looked at. He carried that suspicion for the entirety of Jaycee's captivity, 18 years of waiting for his stepdaughter while being regarded as a possible reason she was gone. The address was 1554 Walnut Avenue, Antioch, California. A suburban house on an ordinary street. Front yard. Neighbors on either side. From the road it looked like a family going about its days. Behind the house was a different world. Dense trees. High fencing. Tarps stretched between posts to eliminate sight lines from any direction outside the property. Roughly 900 square feet of hidden space. Tents, sheds, outbuildings built and expanded over years. One of those sheds had been soundproofed. That detail is not incidental. A soundproofed shed in a suburban backyard is not a renovation project. It was built for a specific purpose, and Garrido had built it before Jaycee ever arrived. He had planned for her before she was taken. She was 11 years old when she first saw it. He told her Doberman pinschers on the property would attack her if she tried to leave. He still had the stun gun. She had already felt what it did to her body on that sidewalk in Meyers. She stayed. What kept Jaycee inside that compound over the years that followed was not only the threat of physical force, though that threat was never absent. Garrido built something with far more patience and precision than the fence or the tarps. He constructed an entire reality inside those 900 square feet. Complete isolation from the outside world. Total economic dependence. A closed religious system in which he cast himself as a prophet, the leader of a group he called God's Desire, with Jaycee and eventually her daughters as his captive congregation, his proof that God had chosen him. He told her, at some point in those early years, exactly why he had taken her. He said he had a sex problem, and that he had taken her so he wouldn't have to do it to anyone else. He presented his own predation as a form of protection. He was keeping the world safe by holding an 11-year-old girl in a shed. She was a child when he said this. She had no framework to counter it. 1994. Garrido was at the front of the property, compliant, while a 14-year-old girl gave birth alone in a shed 30 feet away. No doctor. No hospital. No medication. A child conceived through years of assault, delivered by a girl who had been in that compound since she was 11 years old, with no one to help her and no one who knew she was there. The baby was healthy. Garrido told anyone who ever asked that the children were his granddaughters. He said it with the ease of a man who had been practicing the lie long enough that the practiced version had replaced the original. The birth changed something fundamental in Jaycee. She was no longer surviving only for herself. There was now a child who needed her to survive. A child who had done nothing to deserve the world she had been born into. Jaycee began building routines inside the compound, small structures of normalcy assembled from what was available, because a child required consistency and she was the only person in that space who understood why. She taught her daughter what she could, using the 5th grade education that was all she had from the life before Meyers. Garrido permitted no school enrollment. No birth certificates. No documentation that these children existed anywhere outside the fence. They were, in every official record, invisible. 1997. A second daughter born under the same conditions. The same shed. The same absence of any medical support. Jaycee was 17 years old. She had been inside that compound for 6 years. 2000. While El Dorado County was still processing tips and Jaycee's name appeared in active missing persons files. Compliant. 2004. When her daughters were 10 and 7 and had never once been outside the property unsupervised. Compliant. By now more than half of Jaycee's life had been spent inside that compound. Her daughters were raised believing Jaycee was their older sister. They called Nancy Garrido Mom. They had no framework to see the edges of the world they had been born into because they had never seen anything outside it. Nancy Garrido was not a passive presence in any of this. She enforced the fiction. She was the one who managed the front of the house, the face the neighbors saw, the door that parole officers knocked on, the version of 1554 Walnut Avenue the outside world was permitted to observe. Without her, the deception collapses in weeks. With her, it lasted 18 years. This is exactly the kind of case Cold Watch Response exists to dig into. Not the rescue, not the sentencing, but the 18 years when every door was right there and nobody opened the right one. In the later years of her captivity, Garrido gave Jaycee access to the internet. She found her mother's name. She was, as she described it later, just a couple of clicks from making contact. From seeing her mother's face. From finding out whether Terry was still out there. She could not do it. She wrote about it in her journal. I've been thinking of her a lot lately. I know it will take just a couple of clicks. I could see her. I need to see her. So what's stopping me? I think I'm afraid to take the first step because I know I could not go any farther with it. Why don't I have control of my life? She had the internet. She had a phone. She knew where her mother was. And she could not make herself click the link, because Garrido had spent years making her believe that the world outside was not a place she could return to, that she was too changed, too far gone, that her mother might not recognize who she had become. He planted that doubt the way you plant a fence post. Deep, early, and built to hold weight. By the time Jaycee had the tools that could have freed her, the prison was no longer physical. It was running inside her own mind, in a voice she had learned to mistake for her own. That is not weakness. That is what 18 years of sustained psychological captivity does to a human being. It does not only hold the body inside a fence. It dismantles the self so completely and so patiently that freedom begins to feel like a place that simply doesn't exist for you anymore. Terry waited. Carl waited. Shayna waited. In 1999, Garrido's parole supervision transferred from federal to California state authorities. California Department of Corrections parole officers were now assigned to monitor Phillip Garrido at 1554 Walnut Avenue. Over the next 10 years, they conducted 60 checks at that address. 60 times they drove to the house. 60 times they knocked on the front door. 60 times Garrido answered. 60 times they wrote the same word in their files. Complied. And 60 times they got back in their cars and drove away without walking around the side of the house to look at the backyard. Not once. Despite Garrido's thoroughly documented history of kidnapping women and holding them in enclosed spaces. Not once. Despite a full property inspection being standard protocol for supervising a registered sex offender on parole. Not once. Despite neighbors who could hear children's voices coming from behind the tarps and a soundproofed shed that would have been visible to anyone who had ever walked past the fence line. In 2006, a neighbor contacted Antioch police with a specific report. People were living in tents in Garrido's backyard and children's voices were audible from behind the fence. This was not a vague concern. This was a person close enough to hear those children, doing exactly what you are supposed to do. Police drove to 1554 Walnut Avenue. They spoke with Garrido at the front of the property. They did not go into the backyard. They filed a report noting no issues at the address and they left. Jaycee and her daughters were on the other side of that gate. In 2008, the parole agency launched an internal investigation into Garrido after reports of erratic behavior. Investigators went to the house, questioned him, reviewed the file. Nobody walked into the backyard. Terry waited. Shayna waited. Carl waited. August 24, 2009. Phillip Garrido walked onto the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. With him were two teenage girls, Jaycee's daughters, aged 15 and 11. He was there to request a permit for a religious gathering for his group God's Desire. Jaycee was not with him. She was still in Antioch. The first person to deal with him was Lisa Campbell, the manager of the UCPD events office. An administrator. No law enforcement authority. No file on Phillip Garrido. No reason to know the name Jaycee Dugard. What she had was what was standing in front of her. Garrido's manner was erratic. Fervent. Grandiose. The specific manner of a man accustomed to a closed world in which no one was permitted to push back, where what he said was what was true, and anyone in the room had already been conditioned to agree with him. The two girls with him were not acting like daughters loose in a public space. They were performing. They were doing precisely what they had been raised to do when the outside world was watching. Something in the whole presentation was wrong in a way Campbell could not immediately name but could not set aside. She did not confront him. She scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following afternoon, calmly, giving him nothing that suggested anything had registered. Then she contacted Officer Allison Jacobs of the UC Berkeley Police Department. Jacobs ran a background check. Phillip Garrido. Registered sex offender. Federal parole. Kidnapping 1976. And then the discrepancy that made everything sharpen into focus. Garrido's parole file contained no record of children. He was standing on a university campus with 2 girls he was claiming as his daughters, and his parole officer had no knowledge they existed. On August 25, Jacobs and Campbell met Garrido again in Campbell's office. They gave him nothing. He was relaxed. He reached into his bag and pulled out a self-published book. He spoke about his mission. He was not a man who had been seriously questioned in a long time, and the ease of a person unaccustomed to scrutiny was visible in everything he said. After the meeting, Jacobs went directly to Parole Officer Edward Santos and laid out everything. The girls, the 2 days of behavioral observations, the file discrepancy that should not have existed. Santos recognized immediately that something was wrong. He summoned Garrido to the Concord Parole Office. He required him to bring everyone. On August 26, 2009, Garrido arrived at the Concord Parole Office with Nancy Garrido, the 2 teenage girls, and a young woman he introduced as his niece. Her name, he said, was Alyssa. Investigators separated everyone. Standard procedure. Garrido went into one room. The young woman called Alyssa went into another. In Garrido's room, the story came apart slowly at first. Then all at once. He admitted he had taken a child in 1991. He had kept her in his backyard. For 18 years. He said her name. An investigator walked across the hall and told the young woman what Garrido had just confessed. She went quiet. Then she said her real name. Jaycee Lee Dugard. 29 years old. Last seen at age 11 at a school bus stop in Meyers, California on June 10, 1991. She had been 170 miles from home the entire time. That night, the FBI arranged a phone call between Jaycee and her mother. It was the first time they had heard each other's voices in 18 years, 2 months and 16 days. Terry did not sleep. She flew north the following morning. There is something important about Carl Probin that the original coverage rarely emphasized. 4 years after Jaycee disappeared, he had been a suspect. The stepfather who had watched his daughter be taken and couldn't catch the car. He had carried that suspicion for the entirety of Jaycee's captivity, living inside a grief that was also surrounded by quiet accusation. When the call came and he was told they had found her, alive, he described the moment of understanding what those words meant. He and his wife just both started crying. What the system gave Carl Probin back on August 26, 2009 was not only the news that his stepdaughter had survived. It was the end of 18 years of being looked at as a possible reason she was gone. When Jaycee's aunt, Tina Dugard, spoke to the press after the reunion, she said, "The smile on my sister's face was as wide as the ocean." Phillip Garrido was arrested on August 26, 2009. Nancy Garrido alongside him. The legal proceedings took nearly 2 years. In April 2011, Phillip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of forcible conduct. Both waived all right to appeal, a structure designed specifically to spare Jaycee and her daughters from ever having to take the witness stand or sit in a courtroom while their captivity was reconstructed in testimony. On June 2, 2011, sentencing took place at El Dorado County Superior Court in Placerville. Jaycee did not appear. She sent a statement instead. Her mother, Terry Probin, the woman who had spent 18 years refusing to stop looking, refusing to stop saying her daughter's name, stood in that courtroom and read it aloud. Phillip Garrido sat and listened to every word. "I choose not to be here today because I refuse to waste 1 more second of my life in your presence. Everything you did to me was wrong. I hated every single second of every single day for 18 years. You stole my life and the life of my family." Judge Douglas Feimister sentenced Phillip Garrido to 431 years to life. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life. The 431-year figure was not symbolic. It was architectural, built to make parole mathematically impossible across any conceivable human lifetime. Neither will ever leave a California prison. The case is officially closed. The full record is not. What closed this case was not a task force or a detective with a break in an 18-year-old missing persons file. It was 2 women with no direct authority over Phillip Garrido and no reason beyond their own judgment to believe something was wrong. Lisa Campbell, who had no law enforcement role beyond her events office, and Allison Jacobs, who ran 1 background check and followed the thread all the way to the end. Together they did what 60 parole visits, one neighbor's tip, and a full agency investigation had failed to do over 10 years. They paid attention. The state of California had every reason to pay attention 18 years earlier. Katie Calloway Hall gave them that reason, in her own words, from her own experience, with first-hand certainty about what Garrido was capable of and what he would do the next time access was available. The parole system took her warning, documented it accurately, and filed it under hysteria. 3 years later, Meyers, California. A gray sedan. An 11-year-old girl at a bus stop 5 feet from her front door. Jaycee sued the state. California settled for $20 million, the largest settlement in state history for parole supervision failures. Not as compensation. There is no number that compensates for 18 years. As a legal acknowledgement, the state knew who Phillip Garrido was, what he had already done, and what the record showed he remained capable of, and it still failed at every checkpoint it was given. The California Inspector General's report named each failure in precise institutional language: training, classification, supervision, mental health referral, documentation. It was thorough. It was damning. It named a system that had never been properly designed to find what it existed to prevent. The failures were not aberrations, they were structural. They were the predictable result of a supervision framework that treated a front door as a destination rather than a starting point, that measured compliance by whether a man answered when you knocked rather than by what was on the other side of his fence. The report also confirmed what Katie Calloway Hall had known since 1988 and said out loud and watched be ignored. Garrido had never stopped being exactly what his record said he was. The risk was documented. The warning was filed. The system chose not to act on it, and then it chose not to act on it again and again 60 times over 10 years, at the front door of a house in Antioch while a woman wrote in her journal 30 feet away. 60 visits. 3 separate investigations. A soundproofed shed that no officer in authority ever walked far enough to see. Compliant. Filed. Closed. The word compliant is the load-bearing document of this case. It appears in Garrido's file because parole officers knocked on a door, spoke to a man for a few minutes and drove away. It described a front yard. It said nothing about the fence or the tarps or the 900 square feet of hidden space or the children born inside it without documentation, without birth certificates, without any record that they existed outside the world Garrido had built. The word passed every review. It satisfied every audit. It told the system that 1554 Walnut Avenue was in order. Behind the fence, Jaycee was writing in her journal. Why don't I have control of my life? She had the internet. She had found her mother's name. She could not click the link. Garrido had spent years replacing her sense of self with something he built to keep her from wanting to leave. And by the time she had the tools that could have freed her, the prison was no longer the fence. It was the voice in her own head, running on logic he had installed when she was 11 years old. That is the crime the 431-year sentence cannot fully name. She named it herself. A Stolen Life, published in 2011, every word her own, no ghostwriter, no intermediary shaping what she was allowed to say or how she was allowed to say it. The unmediated account of surviving something most people cannot hold in their minds long enough to fully understand. It became a bestseller because she told the truth about what captivity does to the self, not just to the body. She founded the Jaycee Foundation to support families and survivors of abduction. She did not disappear into her trauma. Nobody had the right to ask that of her. She chose to build something on her own terms in her own time. Real closure and complete closure are not the same thing. There was no trial. No cross-examination. No public accounting of 18 years conducted in the presence of the people who lived through them. Garrido pleaded guilty. Jaycee was spared the witness stand but also spared the courtroom. The formal, public acknowledgement of everything that was done, said in her presence, in his. She sent a statement. Her mother carried it into the room and read it aloud while he sat listening. What the system owed her was the sentence that should have been served in 1988. Everything that followed, the compound, the shed, the journal, the daughters who grew up without knowing who their mother was, follows directly from the moment a parole file filed a woman's warning under hysteria and moved on. Jaycee Lee Dugard woke up on the morning of June 10, 1991, with a baby sister at home, a bus stop a few dozen meters from her front door and summer 5 days away. She stood at the curb in Meyers, California, in a mountain town her family had chosen because it was exactly the kind of place where children were safe. And the system that was supposed to guarantee that, the sentence that should have held, the parole supervision that should have looked behind the fence, the neighbor's tip that should have been followed through the gate, failed her at every point it was given the chance. She was not found by the system. The system drove to the front door 60 times and wrote the same word in its file 60 times and called that supervision. She was found because a woman in an events office looked at a man and trusted what she felt, and then another woman ran a background check and followed a thread that led from a university campus to a parole office to a room where a young woman said her own name out loud for the first time in 18 years. That sequence, instinct, background check, one phone call to parole, one summons, is what 60 official visits across 10 years had never produced. She said her name in a parole office in Concord, California, 170 miles from the bus stop where she was taken, 18 years after a gray sedan slowed at the curb and a man with a stun gun reached out his hand. Behind the fence, the journal kept filling. Pages of a life recorded in the specific darkness of what Garrido built and what she refused to let take everything from her. That journal is the document of someone who kept her own account, honestly, privately, in her own hand, while the official account said compliant 60 times and drove away. She was my protector. She stood up for me. Those words belong to Amber Gonzalez, Fawn Cox's sister, from an earlier Cold Watch response episode. They apply here too. They apply to every family and every file on every desk in every cold case unit still waiting on the question of whether someone went around the back. Cold Watch response. No case stays cold forever. And some of them spend 18 years behind a fence while the door at the front gets knocked on 60 times and the file says compliant.